There is a very particular kind of silence that appears after you leave a narcissist, and it is not the silence of love fading or of forgetting. It is the silence of someone who can no longer bear the image of themselves as they were when they were with you. They do not avoid you because you no longer matter, but because you evoke a truth their ego cannot integrate. That there was a time when they held power, and they used that power to avoid intimacy, manipulate emotions, cause harm, and then justify themselves. The issue, therefore, is not how the relationship ended, but who they became within it. To understand why this avoidance is so persistent and so absolute, it is essential to distinguish clearly between guilt and shame. Otherwise, the narcissist's behavior is easily mistaken for indifference or emotional coldness. Guilt is an emotion tied to behavior. It allows a person to say, "I did something wrong," and still leaves room for repair, apology, or growth. Shame goes much deeper. It does not speak about actions, but about being. It whispers, "I am wrong," that there is something fundamentally distorted in who I am, and for that reason it threatens the entire structure of the ego. According to Carl Jung, when the ego is not strong enough to contain such a painful truth, it does not process the experience through consciousness or remorse, but pushes the entire content down into the shadow so that it can continue to exist without collapsing. For a narcissist, the memory of how they treated you is not merely a mistake within a relationship, it is a crack in the story they tell about themselves, the story in which they are good, justified, misunderstood, forced by circumstances, or simply a victim. Each time your image appears in their mind, it carries a very specific message they cannot fully distort, that there were moments when they saw you open your heart and chose to close theirs, saw your patience and exploited it, saw your desire for connection and responded with coldness. These memories cannot be dismissed by reason, because they challenge not only behavior, but the very identity the narcissist relies on to survive. And because shame offers no safe distance, the way guilt does, because it allows neither dialogue nor confrontation, the narcissist's most natural response is not to return and repair, but to avoid the emotional trigger altogether, that is, to avoid you. Not because you still control them, but because each encounter with you forces them to face a version of themselves they have spent a lifetime trying not to see. This video is not meant to defend the narcissist, nor to cultivate the hope that their shame will one day turn into change or awakening. It is certainly not meant to encourage you to wait for an apology, a belated conversation, or a moment when they finally return to face and admit everything. The purpose of this video is to put the truth back where it belongs, that their avoidance says nothing about your value and says a great deal about their inner limits, that their inability to face what happened is not proof of indifference, but a sign of an ego structure incapable of taking responsibility for itself. When you understand this, you no longer need to interpret that silence, no longer need to ask yourself where you went wrong, and no longer remain trapped in the unconscious effort of waiting for them to look back so that you can feel at peace. This understanding is not meant to pull you back into the past, but to help you set it down, because the moment you no longer need them to face the truth is the moment you have stepped out of the frame of reference that once held you captive. Once it is understood that the core of avoidance lies in shame, rather than in the absence of love or emotional indifference, the way a narcissist's psychological structure operates after a relationship ends becomes much clearer. What they avoid is not you as a specific person, but the inner state that your presence activates within them. You become a point of contact that renders every layer of self-narrative they use to protect their ego fragile. Because in your presence they cannot sustain the image of a self that is reasonable, righteous, innocent, or merely coerced by circumstances. You are a living witness to the moments when they chose avoidance over presence, control over connection, self-protection over responsibility, and when those choices are illuminated honestly, they cannot be reconciled with the story they need to believe in order to survive. According to Carl Jung, experiences like these do not disappear when they are denied. They continue to exist in the shadow, where they are not integrated, yet cannot be erased. For that reason, whenever they are triggered, they carry an emotional weight far beyond the reach of conscious control. This is why a narcissist may appear calm with others, may even enter new relationships quickly, yet become tense, avoidant, or completely frozen when facing you, because in that moment they are not merely remembering a past relationship, but are forced to touch a version of themselves they never had the capacity to acknowledge. This avoidance, therefore, is not a calculated strategy, but a survival reflex of the ego when faced with the threat of collapse. For if they were to look directly at how they treated you, they would have to admit that the problem did not lie in circumstances, did not lie in you, and did not lie in incompatibility, but in the limits of their own internal structure. And this is the crucial point, that shame does not lead them to growth, because shame cannot transform in the absence of self-reflective capacity. It leads only to avoidance, freezing, and the repetition of the same pattern in different forms. For this reason, their inability to face you is not a temporary phase that will pass, but a consistent expression of a psychological system that has never been integrated, one in which anything that touches truth must be expelled so that the ego can continue to exist within the illusion of its own safety. Therefore, there is something important you need to note here. After a relationship with a narcissist ends, what wounds many people the longest is not what happened during the relationship, but how they interpret what happens afterward. The narcissist's silence, avoidance, and refusal to face things are rarely experienced as neutral behaviors. They are felt as implicit judgments, messages suggesting that you were not important enough, not valuable enough, not worth returning to, or taking responsibility for. The danger here does not lie in their behavior, but in how the mind of someone who loved sincerely attempts to assign meaning to that behavior, because human beings do not tolerate gaps in meaning well. When there is no clear explanation, the mind creates its own story, and that story is rarely harmless. For those who invested deeply, especially those accustomed to placing themselves in the role of understanding and regulating others' emotions, the first reflex, when they are avoided, is not to question the other person's inner structure, but to turn the question inward. The human brain seeks a concrete cause to explain loss, because having a reason is far more tolerable than admitting that some things happen not because you are lacking, but because the other person lacks the capacity to remain within truth. In this context, the hypothesis, "I wasn't good enough," though painful, has structure and logic, and is therefore easier to accept than the hypothesis they could not face themselves. End quote. A key factor that allows this interpretation to take deep root is the way the nervous system of someone who lived in an emotionally unstable environment learned to survive. While in a relationship with a narcissist, you were constantly reading signals, adjusting behavior, and asking yourself what you had done to avoid triggering their coldness, withdrawal, or avoidance. That state trains the brain to believe that relational stability depends on your ability to understand correctly, act correctly, and adjust quickly enough. When the relationship ends, that habit does not disappear. It merely changes form. You continue trying to do it right by locating your own fault in the collapse, even when the other person has completely withdrawn from the space of dialogue. The narcissist's avoidance is therefore not experienced simply as withdrawal, but as a form of existential rejection. There is no explanation, no response, no moment of closure, and it is precisely this absence that makes it easy for you to assign yourself the role of the cause. In psychology, People tend to personalize ambiguous events, especially when those events involve attachment loss. Rather than seeing avoidance as an inner limitation of the other person, the wounded mind says, if I were important enough, they wouldn't be silent. If I were valuable enough, they wouldn't disappear. If I were more lovable, easier, less needy, things would have been different. This becomes even more powerful when you are someone who stayed longer than was safe, who tried to communicate, explain, adjust, and hope. Those efforts create an implicit belief that the relationship could be saved if both people looked back. And when only you are willing to look back while they are not, that imbalance is easily misinterpreted as an imbalance of value. You do not see that they are avoiding the truth about themselves. You only see that you are the only one still standing in the space of that truth. A deeper layer of this confusion lies in the fact that shame does not exist only in the narcissist. It can spread to those close to them in the form of self-doubt. When you are repeatedly required to prove that your needs are reasonable, your emotions legitimate, and your desire for connection not a burden, you gradually internalize the idea that something about you needs adjustment in order to be loved. After the relationship ends, their avoidance reactivates that familiar feeling, the sense that you asked for too much, did something wrong, were not gentle enough to be kept. This is not a conscious conclusion, but an emotional reflex formed through prolonged exposure to inconsistency. A painful paradox is that those with the highest capacity for self-reflection are often the ones who remain trapped the longest in this misinterpretation, because they are accustomed to looking inward, to asking, what could I have done differently? And to taking responsibility for their part in every relationship. This capacity is very healthy in mature relationships, but in a context where the other person lacks the corresponding capacity for responsibility, it becomes a blade turned back against yourself. You do the inner work for two people, and when the other avoids, you unconsciously take that avoidance as evidence that you did not do enough. The uncomfortable truth is this: a narcissist's avoidance is not a response uniquely directed at you, nor is it a measure of your worth. It is a fixed reflex in the face of any situation that requires genuine confrontation. Yet the mind of the one left behind rarely sees this immediately, because to accept this truth you must relinquish a powerful illusion, the illusion that if you had understood enough, loved enough, or been good enough, they could have been different. Letting go of this illusion is as painful as letting go of the relationship itself, because it forces you to face a cold limit, that some people are not unable because you were insufficient, but because they lack the capacity to remain within the intimacy you offered. It is here that their avoidance becomes a test of your recovery. When you still interpret their silence as a verdict on your worth, you are still standing within the old frame of reference of the relationship, where your emotional state depends on their response. When you begin to see that their avoidance reflects only one thing, their inability to face their own inner world, you gradually reclaim the authority to define yourself. This is not a sudden moment of realization, but a slow process in which each time you stop asking, where did I go wrong, you take another step out of the old loop. It is important to emphasize that understanding this correctly does not make the pain disappear immediately, but it changes the direction in which the pain flows. Instead of flowing inward as self-blame, self-doubt, and self-diminishment, the pain begins to move toward the real loss, the loss of a relationship you invested in sincerely, with someone who lacked the capacity to respond with equivalent presence. When pain is placed in the right location, it no longer erodes self-worth, but becomes part of a process of maturation. More dangerous still is what often pulls people back into self-doubt, not the narcissist's silence, but the moment they see that person appear with a different face in a subsequent relationship, seemingly gentler, more stable, more attentive, even capable of apologizing and appearing mature in ways you once hoped for but never received. At this point, a dangerous inference easily forms. Perhaps the problem was you. Perhaps you were not special enough to inspire change. Perhaps the person who came later received a better version because they were more deserving. This inference sounds logical, but it rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the change you are witnessing. First, it is essential to distinguish between behavioral change and structural change. A narcissist is entirely capable of adjusting behavior when context shifts, when self-image must be reconstructed, or when a new relationship requires a different performance to gain acceptance. These adjustments can be very convincing on the surface because they occur in the most visible layers: communication style, initial attentiveness, early consistency, or appearing to have learned from experience. What did not happen with you, however, was not a lack of behavioral skill, but a lack of inner capacity to remain within truth when their power was challenged. And that capacity cannot be formed simply by changing partners. The paradox is this: precisely because you touch deeper layers within them, you became the person they could not face. With the next person, the relationship is often kept safer, shallower, or reorganized in a way that demands less genuine presence. This is not because the next person is better, but because the relationship has not or will not activate the regions you once activated. In other words, what you did not receive was not due to a lack of value, but because you went too close to areas where they could not stand. Another crucial point often overlooked is this: narcissists rarely change because they gain insight. They change because they avoid consequences. When a relationship ends carrying shame, image loss, or a sense of failure, they may unconsciously adjust their behavior in the next relationship to avoid repeating the same surface-level scenario. But avoiding a scenario is not the same as understanding and integrating its deeper cause. It is like someone learning to detour around a pothole without ever repairing the road. With you, they fell into the pothole. With the next person, they simply changed routes. That is precisely why them being better with the next person is often missing one crucial element: the capacity to return and face the one who saw them in their truest version. If the change were substantial, facing you would no longer be a threat. But reality is often the opposite. They may live calmly in a new relationship, yet still become avoidant, tense, or absolutely silent whenever there is any possibility of touching the space that once existed between you and them. This reveals that what remains unresolved is not the old behavior, but the inner truth your relationship exposed. Another hard truth to swallow is this: you are often the first person who forced them to confront their own limits, and for that reason, you are tied to the memory of ego failure. The person who comes after you does not carry that memory. The person who comes after is not a witness to the moments when they evaded responsibility, reversed blame, or caused harm and then denied it. So the fact that they can start over in a different space says nothing about the relative value of two human beings. It only says this: you are where truth happened, while the next person is where truth has not yet been named. At a deeper level, comparing yourself to the next person is also part of the process of letting go of the illusion that the relationship could have been saved if conditions had been different. When you see them appearing more stable elsewhere, the mind easily returns to the old question: if only I had been different, less demanding. If only I hadn't gone so deep. But the right question is not what you demanded. The right question is whether the other person had the capacity to respond to what you brought. And the answer, when the whole process is viewed honestly, does not lie in how they behave with someone else now, but in the fact that they could not remain in truth when your relationship reached layers where pretending was no longer possible. The most important point in this section is a reversal of perception. Them seeming to change elsewhere is not evidence that you were less valuable. It is often evidence that your relationship went farther than they could tolerate. You did not lose in an unspoken comparison. You were simply the one who reached a threshold where the mask was no longer sufficient. And when someone must choose between genuine change and avoiding truth, they almost always choose the second option because it demands less. Seen this way, you can begin to question every image of the better version you believed you missed. Perhaps you missed nothing at all. Perhaps the only thing you missed was continuing to stay inside a relationship where your presence, honesty, and depth had no place. And here, their inability to face you even after moving into another chapter becomes the clearest evidence that what remains unresolved is not their feelings for you, but the truth about themselves. Once you look directly at the reality that their apparent change with someone else says nothing about your value, a very important psychological movement begins. Though many people do not recognize it immediately, you find yourself standing before a choice between two paths. One is to keep comparing, keep monitoring, keep placing yourself inside the very measuring system the narcissist used to define human worth. Who is loved more? Who is kept? Who receives the better version? The other is to withdraw from that measuring system entirely and to realize that this entire frame of reference was never built to reflect truth, but to serve their avoidance and self-protection. The moment you stop comparing yourself to the next person is not the moment you win an invisible competition. It is the moment you step out of the game from the very beginning. Comparison always implies a shared standard of measurement, but in a relationship with a narcissist, that standard was never stable. It shifted according to their needs, their fears, and their capacity for self-deception at any given time. When you compare yourself to the person who came after, you unconsciously accept a system of evaluation in which human value is determined by how comfortable someone makes another person's ego feel. And when you accept that system, you are still inside the old psychological space, the space where your worth is reflected through their reactions, rather than arising from within you. What is rarely said is that stopping comparison is not purely a rational decision. It is a deeper shift, where you begin to sense that every time you measure yourself against someone else, you are continuing something painfully familiar, adjusting yourself to fit a structure that was never designed to hold you. In the old relationship, you tried to understand, to yield, to be patient so the relationship could survive. After it ends, comparison becomes a more subtle version of the same movement, still placing yourself in the position of needing to prove that you are worthy. When you truly pause here, a new awareness begins to form. Your worth was never located in whether they could stay with you, and it was never located in how they treat someone else after leaving. Your worth lies in your capacity to be fully present, to love consciously, and to leave when truth no longer has a place. But for this awareness to become not merely a comforting idea, but a lived experience, you must pass through a harder step, relinquishing the need to be indirectly validated by them, even through regret, change, or failure in their later relationships. At a deeper level, the fact that you are still watching, still comparing, still asking, "Did I lose?" reveals that a part of you is still waiting for a conclusion from their side, a belated proof that you mattered. But inner sovereignty does not arrive when you receive that proof. It arrives when you no longer need it. When you stop using their life as a mirror to measure your own value, you begin to return to them the responsibility of carrying their own story, and you return to yourself the right to live without constant interpretation. From Carl Jung's perspective, individuation is not becoming a better version in the eyes of others. It is the process of separating oneself from distorted identifications that once kept you in darkness. For many people, a relationship with a narcissist is precisely where they learn to equate their worth with the other person's reactions, and stopping comparison is the first step in breaking that identification. You do not need to defeat anyone, because the moment you still think in terms of winning and losing, you are still standing on their playing field. When you truly step out of the old frame of reference, a subtle but decisive shift takes place. Their avoidance is no longer a piece of data that needs to be analyzed, and the life of the next person is no longer a measurement you use for reflection. You begin to care more about different questions. Questions that no longer revolve around them, but revolve around you. What kind of connection do I need to feel safe? How long can I remain with truth? And am I willing to leave earlier when I recognize a structure that cannot contain me? These questions are not dramatic, but they offer something more important: freedom from the old loop. And here, the deepest lesson of this relationship gradually emerges. It is not that you loved the wrong person, but that you once placed yourself inside a frame of reference where value had to be confirmed from the outside. When that frame collapses, through avoidance, through silence, through them continuing their life elsewhere, you receive a rare opportunity to rebuild your foundation from within, not by denying pain, but by placing it where it belongs and refusing to let it continue defining how you see yourself. When a narcissist no longer has anyone to blame, that does not mean they begin to take responsibility. It is often the moment their defensive structure must find another way for the remaining shame to exist. For a long time, blame functioned as a release valve, blaming you, circumstances, the past, a third party, incompatibility. When those targets gradually disappear or no longer convince even them, shame is not resolved, it is repressed more deeply. And from there, more subtle reactions begin to emerge. The most common reaction is the transformation of shame into self-pity. Instead of looking directly at the truth that they harmed someone, they retell the story in a way where they are the one who suffered most. They loved the wrong person. They were abandoned. They tried but were not understood. Self-pity allows them to feel pain without responsibility, sadness without change, and most importantly, to keep the image of themselves as deep rather than as someone who caused harm. At this level, shame does not disappear. It is simply dressed in softer language so the ego can tolerate it. Another reaction is emotional freezing, where the narcissist constricts their inner life to avoid any situation that might trigger shame. They become more pragmatic, more surface level, clinging to work, achievement, social image, or relationships that are functional rather than emotional. This is often mistaken for maturity, calm, or moving on, but in reality it is a form of psychological contraction. When they cannot process shame, they choose a way of living that prevents them from touching it, even if the price is long-term emotional depletion. In other cases, shame is converted into silent bitterness. With no one left to attack directly, they maintain a cold, skeptical, or cynical stance toward relationships in general. Love becomes trouble. Intimacy becomes dangerous. And anyone who loves deeply is labeled weak or naive. This worldview helps them feel wiser, but it is simply another layer of defense that prevents them from admitting that they were unable to love without harming. Some narcissists deal with shame by restructuring memory. They do not remember events as they happened, but as they need them in order to continue living. Unfavorable details are blurred, cruel moments are minimized, and their role is edited into the least disturbing version possible. This is not necessarily a conscious lie, but an unconscious self-protective process in which memory is distorted so the ego does not collapse. Yet this also means they cannot truly learn from the experience, because a lesson exists only when truth is preserved in its original shape. According to Carl Jung, what is not integrated into consciousness continues to operate in the shadow, influencing behavior without being recognized. For narcissists, this unintegrated shame often returns in the form of repeated patterns, new relationships with similar structures, familiar conflicts, and the same rupture occurring in different forms. Not because they intend to harm others, but because they have no other way to handle what remains unnamed inside. What is notable is this: it is very rare for narcissists to use shame as fuel for genuine transformation. Not because they do not suffer, but because transformation requires a capacity they never developed, the capacity to stay with discomfort without pushing it outward. Real change happens only when a person can endure seeing who they were, what they did, and not flee from that image. For narcissists, shame is often too large for the ego's capacity. So it does not lead to awakening. It leads to increasingly refined forms of avoidance. And this is the crucial point for you, the one who left to reposition yourself within the entire story. The fact that they no longer have anyone to blame does not mean they will return to face you or face truth. Often the opposite happens. When every doorway of blame closes, they withdraw even deeper into the old structure. Because facing you is not just facing a person, it is facing the entire portion of shame that was never integrated. The fact that you are no longer there to carry, to explain, to soothe, does not make them mature. It simply forces them to manage their inner world in the most familiar ways. At the deepest level, the remaining shame becomes a burden the narcissist carries for life, not as a moral sentence, but as a structural limitation. It does not destroy them immediately, but it shapes how they love, how they attach, and how they avoid truth in future relationships. And for that reason, your leaving was not the failure of love. It was the moment you stopped participating in a system where your emotions were used to regulate an inner world someone else could not carry on their own. Beneath all of these analyses, there is one crucial closing point that needs to be put back in its proper place. This story was never about whether the narcissist feels shame, whether they feel regret, or what they will ultimately do with the shame they cannot carry. All of that belongs to their inner life, and it will continue to operate within the limits they have never crossed. What truly matters is what changed in you once you stopped trying to understand, rescue, or carry what someone else could not face. When you stop interpreting their avoidance as a verdict on your worth, you do not simply close a relationship, you close an entire frame of reference in which you were placed in the position of having to prove yourself, endure, and wait for validation from the outside. In that moment, their silence no longer carries meaning. Their apparent change with someone else no longer holds weight. And the shame they carry no longer needs you to understand it or explain it for them. You return to them the responsibility of living with their own inner world, and for the first time, you fully hold responsibility for your own inner life. This does not make the past more comfortable, but it makes the present clear that you loved with genuine presence, that you left when truth no longer had a place, and that you stepped out of a structure in which love always had to be paid for with self-erasure. When you are no longer the place where others pour their darkness, you do not need to defeat anyone, you do not need anyone's acknowledgement, and you do not need a beautiful ending in order to begin living differently. You only need to keep moving toward relationships where your presence does not trigger shame, but is met with corresponding maturity. And that is not revenge, nor is it a reward. It is simply the natural consequence of choosing to stand on the side of truth first and foremost, the truth of your own self.